Well, welcome back to our series in Galatians. This is part of the Gospel Connections series of lessons. We're going verse by verse through the book of Galatians. This particular lesson is going to center around Galatians 2, 1 through 10. The same message, different channels of that message, and a different context of the people receiving the message. What you're going to see in this lesson is that the gospel is the same, even though Peter and Paul are different, and even though the Jews and the Gentiles are different. And so the gospel message is the same, though the means to communicate the gospel message, Peter and Paul, are different, and the context where the message is received is different. You have Jews in Jerusalem who receive the gospel, and you have Gentiles in Galatia who receive the gospel. There are several lesson objectives. First, to establish that God uses different channels for the same message. Second, to establish that the gospel message is good for differing cultures. I make several statements in the lesson about differing cultures. It's important that you take time to understand what I have covered in the lesson. A different culture is not just the difference between America and the Philippines. There are subcultures. There could be a different culture next door to you. Within a 30-mile radius of where we live right now, there are Islamic and Arab cultures. There are Hispanic cultures, and maybe we would call these subcultures within the greater American culture. But the point is this, is that the gospel is good for all the different cultures. And then the last lesson objective is to expose our tendency to adding externals to the gospel message. It's amazing to see this when I go overseas, where the cultural differences are very, very evident because the culture I come from is now the minority there. But it's amazing to see American missionaries take some of their culture and they begin to make the new believers in those countries take on those American cultural ways. And in some cases, I've seen where those cultural ways are attached to the gospel. And so then you see those believers start looking and acting like Americans and not necessarily like Christians. And they look like American Christians. And it's difficult for us to comprehend this unless you've seen it. But there's a danger here because the changes that God brings about through the gospel in our lives may reflect some external changes, and it should reflect external changes. But we need to be careful that we don't take those external changes and begin adding them to the message of the gospel as we export and preach that message in other cultures or subcultures. The overall lesson is divided into 3 sections. You can teach this over 3 weeks, or if you have time, you may be able to cover more than just one section. The first section is Galatians 2, 1 through 3. The primary principle there is it is imperative that we not export externals with the gospel message. The second section is Galatians 2, 4 through 5. And there we want to make clear that messengers of a false gospel are militant enemies. In that particular section, I give you some development of a few words that the Apostle Paul uses that show they are militant enemies. The reason this is important is because even in ourselves, if we have a tendency to add externals to the gospel, we need to see this as something to be completely refuted in our lives, in our hearts. And we do have a tendency towards this. And so pay attention to the applications that are given. Galatians 2, 6 through 10 is the final section, and that is that the integrity of the gospel is the non-negotiable. there are different means, but the same gospel. And so we want to unify around the non-negotiable and stop dividing over the negotiables. Now, this lesson is heavy on application. This means that by taking the principles of the passage and finding relevant comparisons to today, people can apply these truths in ways that may cause them to be convicted. And that's what we want, is that the gospel message and how it is to be preached and the integrity of the message and what the principle is of the passage of Galatians 2 would be relevantly applied in such a way that it brings about heart change in the lives of your hearers. There may be more ways to apply these truths. Please feel free to do more study and make contextually sound application. God bless.